quiet gun line in a snowstorm was worse than incoming fire. By the time the morphine ran out, Sergeant Sarah Miller had one hand buried in Ranger Jenkins's torn leg, and the other braced against the cot frame to keep from sliding in his blood. The med tent shook hard enough to rattle metal trays off a folding table. Mortars kept walking across FOB Sentinel in ugly, uneven steps. Every blast punched the canvas inward, then let it snap back. Copper hit the back of her throat. Cordite rode in with the cold and sat there, bitter and greasy. Jenkins' monitor gave off a thin analog buzz, then another, farther apart this time. The tourniquet strap kept slipping because there was too much blood and it was too slick. Sarah shoved her knee deeper into his thigh until the muscles in her back started to tremble. He made a weak, broken sound and tried to turn away from the pain. She leaned closer, her breath smoking in the air inside the tent, and muttered, "Don't die on my shift. I hate filling out that trash death paperwork." Jenkins heard none of it, or maybe some animal part of him did. His eyes rolled under half-closed lids, while froth worked pink at the corner of his mouth. The puncture in his chest had turned each breath into a crooked fight. Sarah could smell the chemical heat from gauze, packed into another man across the room. She could hear somebody choking on his own panic behind the hanging tarp divider. She could feel the floor under her boots jump each time another round landed close. Her hands stayed steady anyway. That was the trick. It wasn't courage or faith that kept her going, but work and pressure. She had to count and reassess. She found herself whispering win numbers under her breath. Old ballistic math, rising up where prayer should have been. It was a bad habit, with worse timing. Titan dragged a wounded ranger by the back of his plate carrier toward the shadowed corner where the shrapnel wouldn't spray as hard if the canvas gave way. The dog moved low and efficient, his rec specs filmed with frost, his Kevlar vest dark with melted snow and someone else's blood. He didn't bark. He never did. Then he stopped so fast his claws scraped the plywood floor. The ridge of hair along his spine lifted. Sarah felt him before she looked. Titan's bloody muzzle pressed once into her thigh, delivering a hard, deliberate nudge. His left ear did nothing, but the right one angled toward the tent wall. Outside, the gun line died all at once. There was no return fire, no shouted corrections, and no rattle from the perimeter. There was just the wind grinding ice against canvas, and the slow, tinny complaint of Jenkins's monitor. That sudden quiet made the whole tent feel naked. Sarah's fingers tightened around the soaked tourniquet strap, and the base of her neck went cold. Silence meant the outer line had folded, and whoever had been shooting at their people was close enough now to choose targets one by one. Titan shifted his weight toward the rear wall, his lips peeling back just enough to show the wet white edge of his teeth. Sarah turned her head and saw it. A shadow moved over the tent skin. It was human height, moving with a rifle leading the way, and another shape followed. The canvas bowed inward from a gloved hand. She looked down at Jenkins, at the blood still forcing its way through her hands, and at the empty narcotics tray on the cart beside him. She had nothing left to knock him out, and nothing left to buy him mercy. Another mortar thumped somewhere beyond the motor pool, farther away now and almost irrelevant. The war had narrowed to this patch of canvas, this ruined leg, and this dog going rigid at her side. Sarah's mouth dried out. Her service pistol sat in its holster, but she knew it was too small for what was coming, the way a medic knew a collapsed airway by sound alone. There was one body close, maybe two, with more waiting behind them. If they got through the tent wall, everybody in here would be slaughtered on their cots. Jenkins coughed weakly, his chest rattling. Titan pressed against her leg again, harder this time, then fixed on the moving shadow. Sarah slid one hand off the cot and reached blindly for the nearest instrument tray, buying herself half a breath, maybe less. Outside, heavy boots crunched in the drift piled against the med tent. Inside, the light swung once, and a dark shape blotted the canvas directly over Jenkins's feet. The shadow at the canvas dipped, rose, then stretched long across Jenkins' cot as somebody outside tested the wall with a blade. Sarah's hand flashed to her M9, then stopped there. She knew it was the wrong tool before the thought even finished forming. A sidearm was what you used when the world still had shape, when distance and cover and clean sightlines meant something. This wasn't that. This was canvas, blood, and men, stacking up in the snow, close enough to hear a wounded ranger choke. Titan angled toward the rear of the tent, his body tight, waiting on her without looking back. Jenkins twitched under her knee and made another awful wet sound from the wound in his chest. The empty morphine tray gleamed on the cart while the monitor buzzed again, sounding thin and tired. Sarah dragged one breath into lungs that felt flayed raw by the cold and backed off the cot inch by inch, keeping enough pressure on Jenkins's leg to slow the pumping red mess to a heavy ooze. The tent skin shuddered. A gloved hand hit the outside of it hard enough to leave a dark print through the fabric. She pivoted and saw the aluminum lockbox shoved beneath a folding supply table, half hidden by a spill of bloody wrappers and an overturned basin. The sniper had died before dusk, and she remembered the body coming in stiff with cold. She remembered somebody saying his rifle had been sealed under command authority, but she remembered not caring then, because there had been arteries to clamp and airways to clear. Now the box sat there like a dare. Red stencil tape ran across the lid, and even in the bad swinging light, she could read it plain as a slap. Broken seal means court-martial. Sarah stared at the words for maybe half a second, which was long enough to register the cost, but not long enough to respect it. Another slice kissed the canvas, and the seam near the back pole gave a little. Titan moved 2 steps to cover the blind side, silent and ugly in outline, his breath pluming white through his teeth. Sarah crouched, grabbed a steel pair of medical pliers off the tray she had reached for, and jammed the jaws into the lock hasp. Her gloves were slick, so she tore one off with her teeth and tried again barehanded, feeling the metal bite into her palm through the cold. "Watch my 6," she whispered. Titan's head dipped once. The first strike only rang flat and sharp. The second bent the hasp enough to show bright metal under the paint. The third broke it with a hard, dry snap that sounded too small for the trouble it had just bought her. Sarah ripped the lid open and got both hands under the rifle. The .338 caliber rifle came up heavy and deadweight mean, feeling more like a machine than a weapon, the way serious rifles always felt when you lifted them in a hurry. The sling dragged across the box lip, and the stock hit her scar before she was ready. Pain went white and immediate. It lanced from the thick raised knot on her right shoulder up into her neck and down her ribs. The old blast wound, waking all at once like a severe impact against her frame. She clenched her jaw, fighting the sudden weakness in her arm as she refused to let it fail. Outside, a voice barked something, muffled by the storm, and another shadow spread over the canvas. Titan had gone statue, still near the rear corner, one eye on her and one on the wall, waiting for the breach. Sarah checked the bolt, the magazine, the weight, and the scope by feel. There was no time for anything gentler, and no time for guilt either. The tent shook again from a near impact, sending snow sloughing off the roof in a heavy drag. Dust, frost, and old canvas stink rained down across the blankets. Jenkins coughed and almost rolled off the cot, but Sarah caught the rail with her boot. The rifle was jammed tight into the pocket of her shoulder now, the pain burning there in hot pulses that matched her heartbeat. She could already tell the recoil was going to split the scar open if she fired from a bad angle, but she decided it was better than letting the whole tent turn into a slaughter pen. She backed toward the slit in the canvas where the dead sniper had worked earlier, her boots slipping on blood and melted snow, tracked inside by the casualties. Titan kept drifting with her, covering the dark behind. Sarah planted the rifle, thumbed the thermal on, and brought the sight to her eye. The screen flared, then drowned. White bloom swallowed everything. The storm outside had turned the optic completely blind, presenting a milky wall of static glare with no shape in it, no body heat worth trusting, and no target she could kill before it reached the tent. It was a complete thermal washout. All that weight and all that risk for a court-martial had bought her a dead screen and a splitting shoulder. Sarah held still anyway, forcing her breathing down and tasting blood where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. Outside, something scraped along the canvas in a slow, deliberate line. Inside the optic, the world stayed totally white. Enemy voices moved somewhere beyond it, close and invisible, while the monitor behind her gave another thin buzz, and Titan's claws clicked once on the plywood as he shifted to meet whatever came through first. The optic stayed white. It wasn't fogged or dim. It was completely blind. Sarah kept her cheek welded to the stock anyway, one eye squeezed shut, the other burning behind the dead thermal screen, while the storm outside scraped and hissed across the tent like a file on bone. Every gust shoved powdered snow through the slit in the canvas and across her face, where it melted on her skin and then froze there. The cold hit the back of her throat on each breath, sharp enough to make it feel like she was swallowing broken glass. Behind her, Jenkins's monitor gave off that thin analog buzz again. He was still there and still hanging on, which was good for now. Sarah thumbed the thermal off, knowing a dead tool was worse than no tool at all. She leaned into the narrow opening the dead sniper had used before he bled out on her floor, facing nothing but black wind and moving white static. There were no silhouettes and no muzzle heat, just snow ripping sideways through the beamless dark. She let her eyelids drop for half a beat and listened instead. She took in the sound of the wind, the canvas strain, and distant metal clanging somewhere across the wrecked FOB. Then, under all that, she heard a rhythm. Boots were sinking and lifting as men spread out, trying not to talk, but close enough now that she could hear fabric rub against gear between the gusts. She opened her eyes and waited for light. It wouldn't be much, but it would be just enough, because that was how people survived bad weather and worse odds. They stopped asking for certainty. Sarah drew one slow breath, then another, and the old compulsion kicked in on its own, ugly and useful. She calculated the wind moving left to right in a hard cross, roughly 15 knots, maybe a touch more in the open lane between the tents. The distance was less than what the rifle wanted, but the storm had flattened depth into guesswork. She worked the bolt once, just to feel it lock clean. The steel slid with a tight, expensive smoothness that had no business in a place like this. Her lips moved soundlessly around numbers. She told herself to hold low, favor the left edge, and comp for drift. She couldn't overthink it or yank the trigger. She just had to wait for the flash. The first one came and went so quick it was almost nothing. A cigarette ember wink in the blizzard off to her right. She shifted, found the spot, and pressed the trigger. The rifle went off like a car crash inside the tent. The recoil slammed into her right shoulder and tore a white-hot seam through the thick scar there. Pain lit her arm clear to the wrist. For one rotten second, her hand went weak, and she thought the rifle might jump free. Then the report rolled out into the storm, and somewhere beyond the snow, a body hit something hard and stayed down. Her ears rang. A high metallic whine swallowed the world, then bled, just enough for the next threat to find her. Another flash appeared, lower and smarter this time, belonging to somebody dropping prone and firing from beneath the wind. Sarah tasted iron, knowing she had split the scar open without looking. Warmth had started to creep under her fatigues, slick and ugly, where the old damage had torn wide again. But she accepted it and decided she would bleed later. She reset the stock against the same ruined shoulder, because the left side was useless for this angle, and the second time she pulled the trigger, she did it knowing exactly what it would cost. The hit of recoil was worse. It felt less like impact, and more like something inside her shoulder had been hooked and ripped. Her vision pinched, and black fuzzed at the edges. Still, the round went where it needed to go. A dark shape rose halfway from the drift, as if jerked by invisible wire, then folded backward into the storm. 2 attackers were down. It wasn't clean or pretty, but it was just enough. Sarah dragged the bolt back, heard the brass spit out, and hit plywood somewhere near her boot, then shoved it forward for a third shot she wasn't sure she could physically make. The barrel heat lifted a bitter metal smell into the bloody cold air. Titan did not move, and that worried her more than the gunfire. He was fixed on the blind side of the tent, his head low and his body loaded, not looking where she was shooting because he already knew the next danger wasn't in front of them. Then she heard it. It wasn't outside the slit or beyond the snow lane. It was right up against the sidewall at her flank. There was a soft crush of weight settling into the drift. Then another slow, careful step from somebody close enough now to use the storm for cover and the tent wall for a landmark. Sarah froze with the bolt half-seated under her palm. The canvas beside the supply rack gave a tiny shiver, the kind cloth made when a sleeve brushed it from the other side. Titan's claws clicked once as he shifted his stance. He didn't bark or growl. There was just pressure gathering in a living body built to launch. Sarah kept the rifle where it was, knowing it was too long, too heavy, and pointed the wrong way now. Her shoulder burned wet under the sling. The ringing in her ears had thinned enough for her to catch breathing close by, sounding distinctly human, and rank through the canvas with sweat, old smoke, and the sour stomach stink of a man about to do something ugly up close. The slit in the tent behind the cots went dark for a second as a shadow blocked the snowlight. Then a blade tip pricked through the side panel by the rear corner and started slicing down. The blade came through the canvas with a dry, tearing whisper, moving low and fast. Opening a crooked mouth in the side of the med tent, cold rushed in through the cut, carrying the foul smell of the man outside it. Sarah was still half locked behind the long rifle, her muzzle pointed toward the lane she had just cleared, and her butt jammed into a shoulder that felt flayed open. She had no angle and no time. She tried to swing the rifle and knew at once she was late. The barrel snagged a hanging IV line, then clipped the edge of a folding tray with a bright little metal clatter that sounded enormous in the hush after the shots. Jenkins made a ruined choking noise on the cot. Titan had already vanished from her left. He hadn't run. He had simply vanished. The slit widened as a gloved hand shoved through first, clutching a grenade spoon tight in the fist, followed by part of a face with snow crusted on the lashes and beard. The man sucked in one nasty breath, as if he could already smell the blood inside, and liked it. Sarah's right hand left the stock and went for her sidearm out of reflex. But that was the wrong move again. Clearing the holster, fighting the retention, and making the draw would be too slow in a space this tight. The mercenary's wrist flexed, preparing to lob the grenade blind and let physics do the rest. She started forward anyway, her shoulders screaming as the rifle dragged across her body like dead weight. Then Titan hit him. There was no warning sound and no bark, just 35 kilos of muscle and momentum detonating out of the dark at chest height. The impact folded the man backward through his own opening in the canvas and pinned him half in, half out of the tent. His head snapped against the support pole, and the grenade hand jerked up. Titan's jaws clamped down deep into the arm above the wrist, right where tendons and muscle ran under the winter cloth and skin. The noise that came out of the mercenary was high, shocked, and entirely desperate. Sarah heard fabric tear, followed by the heavy, yielding crunch of structural damage under crushing pressure. The man's hand convulsed open, and the grenade dropped into the snow packed at the base of the wall with a dull, stupid thump. For one insane second, nobody moved. The spoon had flown, and the pin was gone. Sarah saw that, calculated it, and lunged not toward the grenade but past it, because there wasn't time to be careful and nowhere to throw it that wouldn't kill one of her own. The mercenary was still trying to wrench free from Titan, slamming his free elbow down toward the dog's head as his boots plowed trenches in the drift outside the cut. Titan only adjusted deeper, grinding his bite until the man's arm gave out completely. Sarah let the rifle drop on its sling, ripped the fighting knife from her vest, and drove herself through the torn canvas, shoulder first. Fresh pain burst through the old wound, mean enough to blur her sight, but the threat in front of her required simple math. She caught the mercenary under the jaw with her left forearm, shoved his head back against the canvas pole, and punched the blade in under his ribs where the plate carrier gapped when he twisted. It wasn't clean. It never was. The knife hit something hard, skidded, then slid deeper on the second shove. Hot blood sheeted over her glove. The man sagged, then bucked once. Titan kept the ruined arm locked in his teeth until Sarah yanked the blade free and saw the fight leave the man's eyes for good. The grenade had landed in the drift and vanished almost to the fuse cap, smothered by wet snow jammed against the tent wall. Sarah stared at it, counting without meaning to. She counted 1, 2, 3, and nothing happened. Whether it was a bad throw, a faulty fuse, or dumb luck didn't matter. It had not gone off. She grabbed the dead mercenary by the harness, kicked his legs clear of the opening, and hauled enough of him outside to get the canvas flap to fall back into place. Titan released the arm only when she snapped 2 fingers at her thigh. He backed in at once, his muzzle black and slick, breathing hard through his nose. There was no victory noise and no shake, just work done and the next problem acknowledged. Sarah wiped the knife once on the man's jacket and sheathed it with fingers gone clumsy from cold and blood loss. Her ears were still half shot from the rifle, and her shoulder had gone beyond pain into a thick, tearing burn that reached up her neck. She bent to snatch the long rifle before it could bang uselessly against a cot leg. Then the radio on the supply shelf came alive in a blast of static so sharp it made Jenkins flinch. A ranger's voice ripped through the hiss, half drowned by gunfire and wind. RPG! Rocket targeting the med tent. Sarah's head came up. Titan was already looking toward the roofline, his body taut again, while somewhere outside in the storm, a rocket gunner was getting set to turn the whole tent into a fireball. The warning hit Sarah like a hand around the throat. An RPG was aimed at the med tent, leaving her no time to think her way through it. She had the rifle half up already, the sling biting into her torn shoulder, with Titan set hard beside her, when the shape outside finally gave itself away. It wasn't the man or all of him, just the angle of the tube rising above a drift line through the canvas, a dark diagonal where there should have been nothing but storm. She pivoted on one boot, dragging the muzzle across hanging shadows and cots and bodies, then drove the barrel straight at the tent wall. The fabric jumped in the wind, and so did her pulse. She exhaled once and fired through the canvas. The shot blew the world apart again. White-hot pain ripped through her scar and down her arm. The tent flashed, and a breath later there was a hard, ugly pop outside, which wasn't the full detonation of a clean launch, but something wrong and offline. That was followed by the warbling shriek of a rocket going stupid in the storm. Then the blast came, high and sideways, scattering snow and fragments across the roof instead of straight through it. The canvas thudded, and frost rained down. Somewhere beyond the wall, somebody screamed once, then went completely silent. Sarah stayed on the rifle another beat, because deciding the first answer had solved the whole equation was exactly how people died. Smoke lifted from the barrel in faint blue ropes, smelling sharp and oily in the cold. Titan's ears angled forward. The dog didn't relax, and neither did she. Outside, boots crunched in broken patterns now, fast and uncertain, as men either fell back or tried to figure out which of them had just been eliminated through a piece of canvas. Sarah worked the bolt on instinct, a motion that sent a fresh lance through her right shoulder and almost folded her. She locked her teeth and kept going. Jenkins gave a weak, bubbling cough behind her, a sound that hit harder than the blast. He was still there, which meant she still had work left. She turned long enough to check him, noting his pale lips, waxy skin, and froth that was pinker now. He was in too much shock and too much pain And there was still no morphine. The med cart beside him looked picked clean, holding only wrappers, empty ports, and one bent syringe, rolling in a shallow puddle of blood. Sarah tasted cordite and old pennies, and something sour rising from her own stomach. Then the flap at the front of the tent slammed open, and 3 Rangers piled through in a rush of gray dawn, ice, sweat, and rifle smoke. Haze came first, staying low and compact, his eyes doing the fast sweep of a man who expected to step into a kill zone and was annoyed to find it merely ruined. They took in the room in pieces, looking at the dead mercenary half outside the side cut, Sarah on the rifle, Titan with blood drying black around his muzzle, and Jenkins fading on the cot. Then the military police officer came in right behind them, neat as a bad idea, his chin tucked against the cold, a baton hanging from one hip and cuffs already in hand. His gaze landed on the busted lockbox, then the rifle, then Sarah. He did not waste time on gratitude or triage or the smoking hole where a rocket should have come through. "Set it down," he said, stepping toward her like paperwork outranked blast damage. "You broke a sealed weapons case." Sarah almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of course. Of course, the first clean uniform through the flap would care more about a broken lock than the scorched air still drifting in from a failed rocket strike. She lowered the muzzle a fraction, not in surrender, but just enough to keep Haze from reading the room wrong. The MP pulled one cuff free with a metallic click. "You're under Haze," cut across him by racking his rifle so hard the sound cracked through the tent like another shot. The other Rangers followed a heartbeat later, and 4 hard mechanical snaps went off, one after another, ugly and unmistakable. They weren't aimed high or theatrical. It was just enough steel and body language to turn the aisle between cots into a wall. Haze stepped into it first, planting himself between Sarah and the MP with all the warmth of a closed blast door. His face was ash gray with exhaustion, his beard crusted white with thawing frost, and one sleeve dark to the elbow with somebody else's blood. He didn't look at Sarah when he spoke. "System malfunctioned," he said. His voice came out rough and flat, like he was reporting weather. Lock broke on its own. The MP stared at him, then at the rifle in Sarah's hands, then at the splintered hasp on the floor. "That's your statement?" Haze shrugged once. "That's the truth I'm giving you." One Ranger used his barrel to nudge the dangling cuff hand aside. Another moved past them and checked the tent opening without a word. No one praised Sarah or called her a hero because they were doing math of their own. She had kept the tent alive long enough for them to get here, and now they were paying the debt in the only currency that mattered in a place like this: risk. Sarah looked past Haze at Jenkins and watched the monitor stutter out another tired buzz. It was only a temporary reprieve. The rocket had missed, and the MP had backed up half a step. But Jenkins was still dying on a cot with no morphine in the tent, and the morning light leaking through the torn canvas only made his skin look deader. Jenkins had maybe 45 minutes, if the pain didn't kill him first, or maybe less. Sarah got that number the way she got most bad news, by looking instead of hoping. His pulse was fast and useless, skipping under her fingers. His breaths came shallow and ugly around the chest wound, each one dragging a wet rattle through him that seemed to shake the cot. Shock was chewing through what the bleeding had left, and there was nothing in the med tent to blunt it now. There were no morphine ampules, no fentanyl lozenges, and not even the stale mercy of some overlooked vial tucked in the wrong tray. She had already checked twice, then a third time, just to be properly insulted by reality. Every drawer, pouch, and crash case was empty. Haze had bought her a little room with his lie and his rifle, but room was not the same thing as time. The MP had gone outside to snarl into a radio and threaten paperwork at people more useful than him, so she let him. Sarah stripped a fresh glove over her blood-stuck hand, leaned close to Jenkins, and watched his pupils try to stay with her and fail. "Hang on," she muttered, mostly to hear something human in the tent. Titan stood near the flap, his chest heaving, then glanced back once when she reached for her field knife and trauma shears. He knew the look. There would be no more defending. They were hunting now. The snow outside had gone that ugly pre-dawn gray, where everything looked already dead and not yet cold enough to keep it neat. Bodies lay scattered along the edge of the shattered perimeter and between the drifted Hesco barriers, half covered where the wind had started claiming them. Sarah stepped out into it with her shoulder wrapped in a hasty pressure bandage and the pain pulsing under it like trapped heat. The air hit her lungs hard enough to make her cough. The air smelled of blood, diesel, burned insulation, waste, and wet wool, proving that war always had layers. The mercenaries had come in hot and died where momentum gave out, sprawled around, dropped rifles and torn webbing, and blown open rucks. Sarah went straight for the chest rigs and hip kits. She wasn't looking for intel or trophies. She was looking for pain control, for anything she could shove into Jenkins's bloodstream before his heart decided it had carried enough of this stupid burden. She slashed open the first IFAK and found gauze, chest seals, a decompression needle, but no narcotics. The second gave her a field dressing, gloves, a bent airway adjunct, and still nothing useful. She moved faster, sinking to her knees in the snow and thrusting her hands inside dead men's gear to tug, rip, and check. Her fingers went numb, then started to hurt again. Titan ranged a tight circle around her, keeping his nose low and watching the dark gaps between the barriers, while she gutted another kit, and another. Somebody on the wall shouted for accountability, while somebody else threw up behind a truck. She reached the body of a mercenary face down in a drift beside a collapsed section of wire. He was a big man with an expensive winter shell and American-made boot soles. She rolled him with a boot and a curse and went to the med pouch clipped under his plate carrier. The zipper had frozen half shut with blood, so she cut it, and the nylon peeled back with a wet tearing sound. Inside were the usual pieces first, including a tourniquet, a pressure bandage, and 2 sealed syringes of tranexamic acid. Then her fingers hit a hard little cylinder in a clear wrapper. She stopped moving for a second, not out of wonder, but out of fear she was about to see something useless and break whatever thin thread of self-control was keeping her upright. She dragged it free. It was morphine, standard U.S. military issue. The wrapper was slick with somebody's blood, dark and drying in fingerprints across the label. Sarah wiped it once on her sleeve, then again with the heel of her glove, until the print underneath came into view. The black letters were slightly smeared, but she read them clearly. Lot number, DOES 99B. She stared at it while the wind clawed at her hood and blew powdered snow into the dead man's open mouth. X99B. Her brain did not leap. It connected. Yesterday, Vance had signed the shortage report with that bland Quartermaster face and said the shipment hadn't been logged yet. He had claimed there was no issue stock available and told her to come back after inventory reconciliation. She had believed him just enough to keep moving. Now one of his missing narcotics sat in her hand, pulled from the pocket of a dead attacker who had come here under mortar cover. She looked up at the base with new eyes and hated what she saw. The torn wire, the breached line, and the med tent still standing only because she had broken a seal and gotten ugly. The mercenary lay on his back in the snow, carrying U.S. morphine from a lot number that was never supposed to have left controlled storage. This had not been random pressure on a weak outpost. This had shape. Somebody inside Sentinel had been bleeding supplies out a little at a time, and when the hole got dangerous, armed men had come in under the storm to wipe the books clean, along with anyone who could ask the wrong questions. Vance's careful shortages, the empty narcotics drawer, and foreign bodies carrying American painkillers made perfect, terrible sense. Sarah turned the injector over once more, just to make sure the label hadn't changed in her hand. But it hadn't. X99B was clear as a confession. Jenkins groaned in her memory, running out of margin back in the tent while she knelt over a corpse with proof of something much worse than theft. She shoved the morphine into her pouch, then ripped through the rest of the dead man's kit with fresh violence, hunting for more. Behind her, Titan went still and angled his head toward the logistics row. Sarah followed his line of attention and felt the story of the night shift under her feet. The enemy outside had names she didn't know, but the enemy inside wore an inventory badge. Sarah hit the logistics tent hard enough to make the flap crack against the frame. Warm air rolled over her, feeling wet and foul, thick with alcohol gel, stale coffee, damp paper, and the sour human smell of a room that had been sealed too long. It burned her eyes on the first breath. Vance did not look scared, at least not at first. He sat behind a field desk under a bare hanging lamp, one hand moving across a manifest sheet, the other sorting a stack of requisition forms with the bored, annoyed precision of a man determined to stay above the mess. His chair rocked back once when Sarah came in, but he let it settle without rushing. He looked up at her shoulder, at the blood, at the morphine injector in her hand, and gave her the kind of tired bureaucratic stare meant to make crisis wait its turn. Sarah crossed the room and slammed the med ledger onto his desk, hard enough to splash the coffee by his elbow over a stack of manifests. "Jenkins is crashing," she said. "I need the narcotics you said weren't here." Vance clicked his tongue like she had interrupted paperwork. Not a dying man. He reached for the wet forms first, smoothed one flat with his palm, and then looked at the injector. "Power issue," he said, sounding completely calm and annoyed. "System never synced. Inventory didn't clear. I already told you that. You want miracles? Talk to Signal." He even gave a little shrug with it, like this was all beneath him. Sarah watched his face and saw the act for what it was. It was the paperwork posture, the petty authority, and the irritated quartermaster voice meant to make medics feel small. He leaned back, picked up another sheet, and let his eyes slide over the columns, as though numbers on a page outranked blood loss. Titan slipped in behind Sarah and went still near her knee, staying silent as his nose worked the room. Sarah set the injector down in the middle of the desk. X-99B stared up from the wrapper in the yellow light, its black ink smeared with dark red. There was no accusation and no speech, just proof. Vance's gaze snagged on it for a fraction too long before the annoyed mask came back. "Black market stuff gets everywhere," he said, remaining smooth and dismissive. "Counterfeit labels, theft, crossloads. You know how this works." His excuse was too polished and too fast. Sarah leaned in, placing her palms on the desk. "Try again." That got a change. It was small, but there. His eyes cut toward the back tarp, then the trash can, then the desk drawer. It wasn't fear of her. It was fear of what might still be visible. Titan wasn't smelling Vance anymore. He was smelling under him. Sarah caught the shift and moved with it. She reached for the coffee mug as if she meant to slide it aside, clipped it with 2 fingers instead, and dumped the whole thing into Vance's lap and across the manifests. He lurched to his feet with a curse, all the neat bureaucratic control breaking for one messy second as hot coffee spread through his uniform and over the paperwork he'd been hiding behind. That gave Titan his lane. The dog poured under the desk, making no bark and no scrape, just a black shape threading through chair, legs, and boots. Sarah kept Vance's eyes on her. "My patient is drowning in his own chest," she said. "You don't get to hide behind a printer outage." Vance was still swearing and grabbing at the papers, still trying to salvage the desk and pretending his biggest problem was coffee and forms. Then Titan backed out, moving slow and deliberate. Something black and warped hung in his jaws. The smell hit first, a combination of burned plastic and hot metal, followed by that ugly, sharp, chemical reek of cooked lithium. Titan dropped it on the plywood with a sticky little tap. It was a Scorched SKL battery pack with a blistered casing and split seams. Acid crusted around the connectors where it had bled and dried. That was when Vance broke. There was no anger and no bluster. He froze so completely the room seemed to stop with him. Coffee dripped off the edge of the desk in the silence, sounding loud as ticks. The color drained out of his face. His breathing went shallow and fast. His eyes darted from the battery to the back tarp to the trash, and then toward the flap, not seeing a way out of any of it. Sarah crouched, picked up the battery, and felt tacky residue still clinging to the casing. It was recent, half-burned, and clearly a panic job. Somebody had tried to kill a line of contact fast and had not finished the work. She straightened and looked at Vance again. Between the missing pain meds, the empty drawer, armed men carrying U.S. morphine, and a burned comms battery under a quartermaster's desk, there was no coincidence left in any of it. Titan stood at her knee, vapor feathering from his muzzle, staring at Vance with the patient stillness that unnerved men more than growling ever could. Sarah checked her watch, then pictured Jenkins on the cot. He had 20 minutes, maybe. "You burned the wrong thing," she said softly. Vance said nothing. His eyes had gone past her now, listening for footsteps outside, like he couldn't decide which death was arriving first. By the time Sarah stepped back into the cold, Jenkins had maybe 20 minutes left before the numbers stopped being worth saying out loud. Or maybe less if the pain tipped him the rest of the way into shock. She didn't spend any of that time on anger, because anger was slow. She crouched in the lee of the logistics tent and held the Scorched SKL battery beneath Titan's nose. She smelled the burned plastic, the hot metal, and that ugly acid bite from cooked lithium. Titan drew it in once, deep and careful, then again shorter as he sorted layers. His breath rolled out white between them. There was no bark and no dramatic alert. Just a change in tension through his shoulders and neck that told her he had the scent and knew it mattered. Beyond them, FOB Sentinel had gone into the brittle silence that came after a fight. But before anyone admitted how bad it was, curfew had locked the survivors into assigned shadows, and snow and darkness had flattened everything else. Sarah slid the battery into a cargo pocket, checked the pressure wrap on her shoulder, and gave the smallest nod. Titan moved immediately. He kept his nose low, then higher, then low again, weaving just enough to keep the scent line from breaking in the wind. They cut behind a row of fuel bladders first, using the bulk to screen themselves from the motor pool tower. Sarah stayed just off Titan's flank so she could read him and the dark at the same time. Her boots broke the crusted snow with soft crunches that sounded too loud to her ears. The cold had stiffened the blood in her sleeve, and every swing of her right arm tugged at the reopened scar and sent a hot, tearing ache up into her neck. Titan ignored it all. He worked the trail the way good dogs worked a wounded line, not following a neat straight path, but checking corners, crossing and recrossing the scent where the wind tried to smear it thin. Sarah tracked every decision. He ignored a humming generator, a wrecked radio jeep, and a live comms cable hanging from a bent pole. That was good, because it mattered. He was not following electronics. He was following what had leaked off a burned battery and the person who had handled it. They slipped behind a maintenance shed and paused when a flashlight beam washed across a berm 50 yards off. Titan froze with one forepaw lifted. Sarah held her breath until the beam moved on and the night swallowed them again. At the north barrier, Titan paused by a drifted knot of concertina wire and lifted his head toward the comms row, then veered away from the obvious route. Sarah almost followed the line her own brain wanted and stopped herself. It was too exposed and too easy. Titan was reading the edges of the trail, not the clean military map in her head. He tracked burned lithium, human sweat sharpened by panic, maybe machine oil, or maybe old dust cooked warm inside gloves. The scent had been carried, brushed onto cloth, and transferred by hurried hands. Titan slid between stacked pallets, and brought her through a dead strip behind the vehicle graveyard, where no patrol bothered to walk because nothing out there mattered on paper, which made it perfect. Sarah dropped lower and followed. Once, a pair of MP officers smoked under a lean-to less than 30 yards away, their cigarette tips moving red in the dark, while they bitched quietly about relief never showing on time. Titan drifted them wide without slowing, his breath feathering white. The darkness under curfew felt thick enough to bruise, and even the snow looked black where the wind had polished it to old ice. The trail narrowed near the perimeter offices, then bent hard toward the abandoned communications section. Sarah knew the bunker by shape before she saw the door. It had a low profile, sandbags half buried in drift, and a warning placard hanging crooked. It was officially dead space. Titan slowed as they got close, making each step smaller and more deliberate. The scent was fresh enough to hold. Sarah went to one knee behind a snapped barrier and listened. She heard the wind scraping wire, a far-off generator, and loose sheet metal tapping somewhere back toward supply. Then she caught something else under it, faint but real. The fast, irregular sound of key taps. Titan's head came up. He did not growl or make a sound. He just locked every muscle in his body and stared forward so hard the line of his shoulders showed under the Kevlar. Ahead of them, the old comms bunker sat dark, except for a hairline of weak yellow light leaking under the door where no light should have been. When the wind shifted, the smell reached Sarah a second after Titan. It was burned acid, human sweat, and warm circuitry trapped in a closed space. It wasn't magic or some nonsense about a dog smelling radio waves. It was chemistry and fear, coming off a place where somebody was still talking after trying to destroy the first machine. Sarah put one hand lightly on Titan's shoulder to hold him and stared at the door while the tapping continued inside, small and steady as a pulse. Jenkins had 20 minutes, maybe less. Vance had a hidden room, a live connection, and just enough time left to bury everyone with him if she gave him one more quiet minute. Sarah kicked the bunker door in and knew at once she had done something stupid. The latch blew inward, and her boots snagged a thin line stretched ankle-high across the threshold. It snapped with a dry little pop, too small for the damage it carried, and somewhere under the desk bank a silent alarm turned into a shrill, mechanical scream. Vance jerked up from the terminal in the dirty blue glow of the monitor, his headset half on and his pistol already coming free, before the chair finished tipping backward. He fired on reflex. The round shaved across Sarah's right shoulder. It tore her jacket, grazed her skin, and ripped the old scar wide open again. Pain hit hard enough to numb her hand for a beat, and blood ran warm under her sleeve at once. The bunker smelled of hot dust, wet wool, burned lithium, and old metal. Cables crawled along the floor, and a mapboard hung crooked on one wall. Vance looked less like a criminal mastermind than a quartermaster who had finally run out of forms to hide behind. Then he fired again. She moved, dropping low and driving straight into him before he could reset. The metal floor was slick with tracked-in slush and smeared blood, causing her boots to skate. Her shoulder lit white when she clipped the edge of the table, but momentum carried her through and into Vance's waist. They went down hard with no grace in it, just knees, elbows, and dead weight. His pistol hand cracked off the deck and bounced. Sarah got one forearm across his chest and tried to kill the angle on the gun. He bucked hard and slammed an elbow into the side of her head, sending a burst of light across her vision. The alarm kept sawing at the room. Titan flashed past her left knee, black and silent. Vance sucked in one panicked breath and started dragging the pistol back up. Titan hit the gun arm above the wrist and locked on with enough force to crack bone or tendon, or maybe both. Vance screamed as the pistol fired into the ceiling, causing dust and rust to snow down. Sarah lunged again, and all three of them slid across the deck into a cabinet hard enough to rattle drawers open and dump loose forms over the floor. Vance abandoned the gun and went straight for her throat with his free hand. His fingers dug in under her jaw, and his thumb crushed the side of her neck. Sarah clawed at his wrist and got nowhere. Titan kept worrying the ruined arm, pulling sideways, but Vance twisted with the bite and held on. The bunker narrowed to heat, pressure, and the stink of his breath. Her right shoulder burned, where the graze had reopened the scar into something wet and ugly, and her lungs started to strobe. Her fingers felt blindly for gauze, a penlight, or steel on her vest. Her fingers closed around the hemostat. She ripped it free and drove it up under his collar line, with no room for elegance and no strength left for a second chance. Vance made a broken animal sound. His grip loosened, and Sarah shoved harder. It wasn't a lesson or a technique, just survival. His hand flew to the wound as air tore back into her chest like broken glass. Titan ground deeper into the arm until the pistol skittered loose and vanished under the desk. Sarah rolled on top of him and pinned him there with a knee in his gut while he choked and stared up at her in disbelief, as if he had just learned too late that clerks bled the same as everyone else. The terminal still glowed beside them, with coded traffic stacked across the screen. The alarm still screamed. Outside, boots were already moving because of the tripwire she had snapped. Sarah leaned down close enough for him to hear the words through his choking. "Password, now, before your brain starves." He tried to spit blood into her face and managed only a wet cough. She pressed the steel harder and watched his resistance break in stages. He gave up the password first, then the locker coordinates for the hidden morphine cache. Sarah repeated both back once, flat and clinical, forcing them into memory while Vance sagged under her in twitching pieces. She had just enough time to yank the drive from the terminal before the bunker door blew wide and military police flooded the threshold with their rifles raised, dragged there by the screaming alarm. Flashlights hit Sarah's face, the blood on her hands, the hemostat in her fist, and Titan's jaws red around Vance's arm. "Drop it!" somebody yelled. Sarah did not move. For one frozen second, she was exactly what they saw. A blood-soaked medic kneeling over a dying officer with a steel instrument in her hand, and a military working dog holding the room still. The interrogation room felt colder than the storm had. It wasn't because the heat was low, but because nothing in it admitted blood, noise, or weather had any right to exist. The gray walls and gray steel table sat in the gray morning light leaking through a slit window that had forgotten how to become day. Sarah sat with one wrist cuffed to a steel ring bolted into the tabletop and the other wrapped in dried blood nobody had bothered to clean off completely. Her shoulder had been patched, not treated, just tape over torn muscle that was good enough for paperwork. Titan lay against the far wall under the eye of an MP who watched him the way anxious men watched mines. The room hummed softly, with ventilation and fluorescent ballast. There were no accusations yet, and no shouting, because waiting was part of the weapon. Jenkins was either alive because the coordinates had been real, or dead because the system had found one more way to waste time, and she had no way to know which. Then the door opened, and Sterling stepped in, carrying a thin packet and an expression that had no wasted movement in it at all. He crossed the room, looked once at Sarah, once at Titan, and tossed the packet onto the table. It slapped flat between them. NDA, of course. Sarah glanced at the heading and almost laughed, not from humor, but from accuracy. There was no metal and no charge sheet first, just silence with a signature line. Sterling sat across from her, as if this were a briefing instead of a burial. "Quartermaster Vance will be reported killed during the mortar attack," he said, his voice staying low enough that she had to lean into it to catch every word. "The contractors outside will not exist on paper. The supply diversion lane tied to Sentinel folds back into an ongoing Defense Department operation tracking cartel medical trafficking." He let that sit. Sarah watched him while he spoke, seeing no triumph and no sympathy, just a man balancing damage. She looked down at the packet again, noting the non-disclosure agreement, the transfer order, and the administrative scar tissue. "I'm not signing that," she said. Sterling did not blink. "Then I make this uglier." Sarah held his eyes. You mean truer? That almost moved one corner of his mouth. Sterling laid out the rest in clipped lines, never drifting into a speech. The leak had been monitored, and the chain ran higher than Vance. Sentinel was one piece of a bigger net. The attack had accelerated before the people above him were ready, and Sarah had torn the curtain down by surviving too loudly and dragging the Quartermaster's channel into the open. None of that changed what came next. The machine would close around the mess and file it under something clean. Sarah listened and sorted motive from method, realizing he was not asking her to believe the cover-up was moral. He was simply informing her it was operational. When he stopped, she said, "Then charge me. Put my name on it. Put his name on it. Put the whole rotten thing on paper." Sterling opened the packet, withdrew a second page, and slid it across the first. The page contained the witness timeline, weapons inspection notes, Haze's name, the names of the Rangers who had stood in the med tent with rifles up, and the real blade. Your team obstructed a military police detention under arms and lied to a federal investigator about a sealed weapons breach, Sterling said. If you refuse this agreement, I prosecute Haze and every Ranger who backed his statement. The room went dead still after that. Sarah stared at Haze's name until the letters blurred. That was the part nobody wrote into doctrine: debt. Haze had bought her time because she had bought them life. And now the bill had arrived in a clean room with a steel table and no blood on the floor. She thought of Haze racking his rifle between her and the cuffs. She thought of Jenkins rattling on the cot. She thought of Titan in the bunker doorway, while military police pointed guns and pretended law arrived without a body count attached. Sterling set a cheap plastic pen beside the packet. The click when she thumbed it open sounded absurdly loud. Her cuff bit her wrist when she bent forward, and her shoulder throbbed hot and deep under the bandage. She signed because there was no version of courage left that did not bury somebody she could name. Sterling took the pages back at once, efficient as a clerk closing an account, and then he stood. For the first time since entering, he looked almost tired. He reached up to his own shoulder, found the Tier 1 patch there, and tore it free. The Velcro rip split the room clean in half, sounding loud, rough, and final. He set the patch on the table in front of her with more care than he had given the NDA. Sarah looked at it and felt something sharp move under her ribs that had nothing to do with the wound. Sterling kept his fingertips there a second, then said, "The morphine reached Jenkins in time. He made it." Sarah shut her eyes once, accepting that was all the relief she would let herself have. When she opened them, Sterling had stepped around the table. Titan rose without a sound. Sterling crouched just enough to run one hand once over the dog's head, right between the rec spec straps, offering no ceremony, just acknowledgement. Then he turned toward the door. Sarah let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "That it?" she asked. "Paperwork, exile, and a souvenir?" Sterling paused with one hand on the knob and finally looked back, his face giving her nothing easy. "Stay warm, Stitch." Then he left, and the door shut softly behind him. Sarah stayed where she was, with the patch on the table, the cuff on her wrist, Titan's breathing steady in the corner, and the bitter knowledge that the truth had survived only by agreeing to disappear.